The whole room held its breath when the slide changed, and I watched my manager stand at the podium with the confidence of someone who had earned the right to be there. She hadn't. But I sat very still in my chair, and I said nothing, because I already knew exactly how this story ended. My name is Isla, and I was 32 years old when it happened. 3 years into a role as a senior product analyst at Vantage Care Systems, one of the largest regional healthcare networks in the Mid-Atlantic. We ran 11 hospitals, 47 outpatient clinics, and managed patient records for close to 500,000 people across 4 states. The work was meaningful in a way that made the politics almost bearable. Almost. I had come to the job from a smaller analytics consulting firm, where I'd spent 4 years learning how to translate messy, poorly structured clinical data into something decision-makers could actually use. I was good at it. I liked the precision of it, the way a model, when you built it correctly, said exactly what it meant and nothing more. I liked that data didn't have an ego and didn't take meetings personally. I had, at various points in my life, wished I were more like data. My manager had been at Vantage for 12 years. 12 years is a long time at any organization, but in a regional healthcare network, where the real power lived in knowing which C-suite executive preferred two-pagers over spreadsheets, which department heads had been passed over for promotions and still hadn't forgiven anyone for it. 12 years meant something. She had relationships that stretched back a decade and a reputation built entirely on those relationships, rather than on any specific body of work I could point to. She was good at positioning, she was good at credit, she was very bad at analysis. What she was bad at, specifically, was the kind of slow, uncomfortable work that real modeling requires. Sitting with data that doesn't cooperate, questioning your own assumptions, going back to the source when the numbers don't add up instead of adjusting the output until they do. That part of the job she delegated. She delegated it largely to me. I spent 5 months, October through February, including the stretch from Thanksgiving through New Year's when my extended family came through. And I worked every morning before they woke up, building what I called the Discharge Follow-Up Index. It was a patient pathway model designed to solve one specific problem: identifying which patients, after leaving a hospital or surgical center, were quietly on their way back within 30 days, before they showed any symptom that would trigger an alert. Early outreach to those patients reduced readmissions. Fewer readmissions meant fewer federal penalties under the value-based care payment programs that were reshaping how health systems got reimbursed. The financial case was clean. Fully deployed across our network, the model would save approximately $3.1 million per year in avoided penalties alone, not counting downstream operational savings. I validated it on data from 2 of our smaller facilities first, because I didn't want to walk into a room with a theory. I wanted to walk in with proof. I ran the pilot results by our chief medical officer's office to make sure the clinical logic held. I got informal sign-off from the VP of Quality before I brought it anywhere near my manager. By the time I walked into her office on that Thursday afternoon in October, I wasn't presenting a draft. I was presenting something finished. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both of which were about presentation format rather than methodology. Then, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is impressive, Isla. Let me sit with it for a little while before we take it to anyone." Something with this kind of financial impact has to be positioned carefully so leadership understands the full story. I told her I understood. I emailed her a summary document, a project brief, and a link to the shared drive folder where all the files lived. I set a calendar reminder to follow up in 2 weeks. 3 weeks after that, she stood in front of the company's full executive leadership team and presented my model as hers. She used the phrase "my initiative" 11 times during the 40-minute presentation. I had a printed copy of the agenda in my lap, and I kept tally in the margin in small, neat vertical marks. The same way I used to keep score at my younger sister's high school soccer games when I was the one designated to track stats. 11 times. My name appeared exactly once, in a block of text at the bottom of an appendix slide, listed alongside 2 other names under the heading Data Support. She thanked us briefly as a group at the end of that section. She didn't look at me when she did it. She received a standing ovation from the executive team. I received a $500 spot bonus deposited directly into my checking account and a thank you card signed by people I had never spoken to. I kept the card for about 4 days before I recycled it. I went home that night, sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and the particular kind of calm that only comes after a very long day of performing calm you don't actually feel, and I made myself think clearly about my options. I could file a complaint. I could send an email to her boss or to HR, laying out what had happened. I could confront her directly and give her the chance to acknowledge what she'd done. I didn't do any of those things. I sat there and I thought about what happened to people at Vantage who made complaints about managers with 12 years of institutional goodwill and a fresh executive endorsement. I thought about the analyst 2 departments over who'd raised a concern about credit attribution the year before and spent the next performance cycle being described in every review as not aligned with team values. He'd left within 8 months. He'd been good at his job, better than several of the people who'd stayed. I went to my laptop instead. I opened Google Drive, created a new folder, and named it Work Backup Fall. Purposefully dull, the kind of label no one notices in a file directory. Into that folder, I moved everything, every version of every model file, timestamped automatically by my coding environment. Every email I'd sent her over 5 months with progress updates and draft attachments, some of which she'd responded to with a single "thanks, looking good," and nothing more. Every Slack thread where she'd asked me to walk her through the statistical methodology one more time before a meeting, or to pull the specific citations she'd need if leadership asked questions. I saved everyone. I didn't delete anything from the original shared drives. I just made sure I had my own copy of everything in a place that lived entirely outside any system the company could reach. Then I closed the laptop, washed my glass, and went to bed. My manager's promotion came through 2 weeks later. She was named Vice President of Patient Experience, a newly created title built around the project she'd just presented. The role came with a 16% salary increase, an office with an actual door on the 8th floor, and leadership of a new company-wide initiative called Project Compass, a $3.3 million, 18-month overhaul of the patient engagement system, built directly on top of the model I had designed. She did not ask me to join the project team. I found out about the team composition from my colleague in risk management, a calm, precise man I'd worked alongside on a claims audit the previous spring, who had a habit of appearing at my desk when there was something he thought I needed to know, and nowhere comfortable to put it. He came by on a Monday afternoon, stood at the edge of my cubicle, and told me very quietly that the Compass team had been assembled, and my name wasn't on the roster. She had staffed it with people from business development and client relations. People who were accustomed, I understood him to mean, to presenting other people's frameworks as narrative, rather than examining whether the frameworks held. I thanked him. He nodded. That was all that needed to be said. For the next several months, I kept my attention carefully on my own work. Our chief medical officer had a staffing optimization project for the ICU units that needed an analytical framework, and I took it on. I asked for structured feedback at every milestone and sent written summaries after every significant decision. Partly because it was good professional practice, partly because I was building a record of my output that was entirely mine, time-stamped, documented, untouched by anyone else's name. I kept my reputation as someone who delivered clean, rigorous work without drama. In that environment, at that time, that reputation was the only asset I was certain I could hold on to. The whispers about Project Compass started finding me around the 6-month mark. My colleague from Risk came by again, this time with 2 coffees, which told me the information was significant enough to warrant the gesture. The project was sitting at roughly 38% completion against a timeline that had consumed 60% of its runway. A healthcare technology vendor out of Atlanta, hired to build the patient-facing application layer, had delivered almost nothing that matched their contracted scope. The vendor invoices, however, had been approved and paid without going through the standard authorization process. He put the unauthorized expenditures at close to $520,000. Does anyone know where it went? I asked. He looked at his coffee. The audit team has some questions. I didn't do anything with that information. I want to be clear about that. I didn't forward it to anyone, didn't send a carefully worded email designed to land on the right desk, didn't engineer any situation that might accelerate the project's exposure. I just sat with it, the way you sit with something you know but can't use yet, and I kept working. What I hadn't prepared myself for was how much the waiting would cost. Month 9 was the hardest. I don't know why that particular month was the one where everything almost gave out. Maybe it was the slow accumulation of watching someone else receive recognition for work that lived in my own hands. Or maybe it was just 9 months being the point where patience stops feeling like strategy and starts feeling like something you're doing wrong. One Thursday evening, after the floor had emptied and the only light left on was mine, I opened a blank email and started writing to HR. I didn't write it in anger. Anger would have made it easier to delete. I wrote it carefully, in the precise and neutral language of someone who has learned that clarity is more credible than emotion. I documented the timeline. I referenced specific emails and Slack messages by date. I described what had happened in that executive presentation without editorializing. I attached a sample file, a model version from the previous July, with its timestamp visible in the metadata, as proof of what the full documentation contained. Then I sat there for 20 minutes looking at it. I thought about the analyst who had left 8 months after raising a concern. I thought about the folder in my drive, still sitting there quietly, still full. I thought about the fact that my manager was currently the subject of an internal audit inquiry that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with what she had done on her own. I thought about what it would mean to file a complaint right now, before that inquiry had surfaced anything, before I had any formal standing in the situation, before anything had happened that would make my complaint land as a fact rather than a feeling. I closed the email without saving it. I called my younger sister instead. It was almost 11 o'clock on a weeknight. She answered on the second ring, because she is the kind of person who answers the phone when her sister calls late without needing to know why first. I told her the short version. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill very few people actually have. Then she said, "You have all the documentation, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then trust it. The documentation doesn't expire." I stayed on the phone with her for another 10 minutes, talking about something completely unrelated, and then I went to sleep. The call came 11 months after the executive presentation. It was our COO, a focused, unhurried woman who had been with Vantage for 7 years, and who I had spoken with in depth exactly twice. She didn't have her assistant schedule anything first. She called my desk directly at 2 in the afternoon and asked if I could come up to her office. I took the stairs. I had learned that the walk-up gives you about 90 seconds more than the elevator does, and I used every one of them. She was sitting at the round table near the window when I came in, not behind her desk. That positioning was deliberate, and I registered it immediately. She wasn't positioning herself above me. She needed something. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Project Compass is going to fail its state compliance audit," she said. "We have 5 weeks. The underlying model isn't functioning as reported, and the state health department is sending a full review team." She paused. "Your manager has indicated that the original architecture was built on work you developed. She says you're the only person with enough understanding of it to bring it into compliance." I let a moment of quiet sit between us, the kind of quiet that communicates something without requiring words. "I can do that," I said. "But I want to be brought in as project lead, not as a support resource. I want that role formalized in writing, with my name on all internal and external deliverables, before I open a single file." "Of course," she said, the way people say it when there is genuinely only one possible answer. "And I want to brief you on something before we go any further. There's context you need to have." She looked at me without expression. "Send it to me today." I went back downstairs. I opened my drive, compressed the full folder, 5 months of version files, 43 email threads, 14 Slack exports, and the 2-page timeline summary I had written months earlier in plain, unloaded language, into a single attachment. The subject line was, "Background Project Compass." I sent it at 3:24 p.m. At 4:51, the COO's assistant emailed me a confirmed onboarding meeting for the following morning, and a note that my title change had been submitted to HR. My manager came to my office the next day. She was wearing a blazer the color of old mustard, a careful, muted color, like something chosen in a hurry by someone who needed to feel composed. Her voice was steady, but her hands were wrapped around her badge lanyard, turning it in a slow, anxious loop. "I heard you're leading the Compass recovery effort," she said. "That makes sense. Your work is at the core of it. I've said that all along." I looked at her. "You said my initiative," I told her. 11 times, in front of the executive team, I kept count. Something crossed her face, a quick, complicated movement, like a room where 2 expressions are fighting for the same space. What I said in that presentation and what I actually meant. "I sent the COO my original files this morning," I said. "With timestamps, she has everything she needs to understand the timeline on her own." She stood very still for a moment, then quietly, almost carefully, "We could get past this, work together the way we used to." I stood up. I picked up the project brief I'd been annotating since 7 that morning. "We didn't work together," I said. "That's the whole point." I walked out. I had a meeting to get to. The internal review that followed was thorough and moved quickly. It found that my manager had submitted inaccurate progress reports to the executive committee on at least 4 separate occasions. Milestone completions claimed before any completion had occurred. Budget summaries that omitted the unauthorized vendor payments entirely. A state compliance filing built on data that couldn't be reconciled against the actual model. The $520,000 in vendor expenditures was referred to the legal team for a full audit. She was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks of the review's initiation. She resigned before it concluded. 2 members of the project team she'd assembled also left in the weeks that followed, quietly, without ceremony, the way people leave when they realize the thing they'd been protecting no longer exists and staying would only extend the discomfort. I didn't track their departures closely. I was already deep in the rebuild. 9 weeks, that's how long it took. I want to be honest about what those 9 weeks actually looked like, because I'm aware this story sounds cleaner from the outside than it was in real time. The model had to be re-architected in 2 places to meet state reporting requirements that had changed during the months the project sat stalled. The Atlanta vendor had modified a third-party data pipeline in a way that broke the validation logic. They'd rerouted a claims feed through a system that logged inputs inconsistently, which meant I had to manually reconstruct 3 months of data before I had a clean baseline to build from. It was unglamorous, painstaking work that happened mostly between 7 and 9 in the morning, before other meetings started, and after 6 in the evening when I could focus. My colleague from risk management worked alongside me every day for the first 4 weeks. He arrived each morning with 2 coffees and a list of what he'd reviewed the night before. He didn't ask me what had happened or how I was processing it. He asked whether the validation framework was holding, and whether I needed access to anything in his department's data warehouse. I don't know if he understood fully what that steadiness cost him in time and attention, and I am not sure I told him clearly enough what it meant to me. We came in under the revised budget by $280,000. We passed the state compliance review with full marks on every category. The reviewing health department official sent a follow-up email to our team saying our documentation package was among the most thorough she had encountered in a regional health system audit. I printed that email and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't frame it or anything, I just kept it there. When we presented to the board of directors, I stood at the front of that conference room. The same room on the 8th floor, the same overhead lighting, the same long table where she had once stood and used my language and said, "My initiative," 11 times. And I told the story of the model in my own words, with my own name attached to every slide, beginning with the pilot validation data from 16 months earlier. Our CEO spoke after the presentation concluded. She said, in front of the full board, that the work represented exactly the kind of grounded, principled leadership that a health system needed not just in its analytics division, but throughout the entire organization. I said thank you. I meant it precisely as much as I said it and not a single word more. My colleague told me, months later over lunch near the office, that my former manager had applied for 2 VP-level roles at comparable regional health systems in the area. In both cases, the hiring committees had reached out to Vantage for a professional reference. He didn't know the specifics of what was said in those conversations. He knew that neither position had been offered. I hadn't arranged any of it. I hadn't spoken to anyone at those organizations, or reached out to mutual contacts or done anything except let an HR process, set in motion by an internal audit, run its natural course. Some consequences follow people not because anyone orchestrates them, but because the record exists and the record is honest. And healthcare administration is a small enough world that people making hiring decisions tend to ask the right questions. 14 months after the day I sat in that conference room making tally marks in the margins of an agenda, I was named Director of Clinical Analytics at Vantage Care Systems. I was the youngest person to hold a director-level title in the analytics division. The role came with a team of 8, a seat on the Patient Outcomes Steering Committee, and a formal part in setting the organization's data strategy for the next 4 years. I still have the folder. Work backup fall. It's still sitting in my drive. I haven't opened it in a long time, but I haven't deleted it either. I keep it the way you keep a smoke detector, not because you're expecting a fire, but because you understand now the cost of being unprepared for one. The thing I carried out of those 14 months, and I still carry, is this. When someone takes something from you and you want it back, the instinct is to make the taking visible. To raise your voice, to go on record, to force the moment of acknowledgement before you're ready for what comes after it. I understand that instinct completely. I lived with it every day for close to a year. The night I sat at my desk with that HR email drafted and ready, the instinct nearly won. But here's what I know now that I didn't fully know then. When you make the taking visible too early, you shift the story from what happened to how you feel about what happened. And once the story becomes about your feelings, you lose the ground. You become the aggrieved party. She becomes the veteran executive who is being treated unfairly by a subordinate with a personal grievance. The audience for that story has already picked sides. And they didn't pick yours. The documentation changes that entirely. Documentation is not about feelings. Documentation is about time, about what existed and when, and in whose words and with whose name attached. It doesn't come across as bitter or difficult or not a team player. It doesn't have a tone of voice. It just sits there, organized and time-stamped, and it says what it says. I didn't win by being the loudest or the most strategic in any dramatic sense. I won by being patient enough to wait until the truth had somewhere to land, and careful enough to make sure that when it did, everything I needed was already in order. The truth did the rest on its own schedule. All I had to do was be ready.